The hour of 10:15 having arrived, we will call the House Tax Committee to order. We have the attendance here taken, and we do have a quorum, so we are in order. Today's agenda, members, is Mr. Jared Swanson, legislative analyst, and then we'll go into House Fiscal with Ms. Templin and Ms. Highmark. And I just need to make a correction from a statement I made yesterday, in that I have always heard governor's budgets, and I want to know what the governor's thinking and what the administration's thinking. I've always heard them in detail, not cutting them off at all for any reason. But now we're not able to get information that we would need to hear those bills from the department. So we will, we're going to put that governor's budget on hold until the department can do their job and get us the information we would need for a hearing on the governor's budget. So with that being said, we're not going to hear the governor's budget until some things change, because we can't. We can't go forward with the governor's budget when they can't get us numbers. That's very unfortunate. But so we'll start out. If you could please introduce yourself for the record, sir. And today's agenda is, I'm sorry. Vice Chair Joy, if you'd move the minutes.
Move the minutes to be approved.
Okay, thank you. And any discussion on the amendments, any additions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, the minutes are, any objection? The minutes are approved. So, and there's several ways you can do something like moving minutes. Is if there's no objection, you can go forward, or you could take a vote. We'll probably just go in the no objection route, because I do want to know if there's an objection or a typo, but with the staff we have, for that'd be highly unlikely that that could possibly even happen. So with that, we will go to Mr. Jared Swanson. Please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Mr. Chair and members, Jared Swanson with House Research. Today we're going to start with an overview of the property tax system. I want to mention before I get into the slides that within your packets there should be a larger handout that has a lot more detail on all of the things we're going to cover in the presentation today, as well as a few things that sort of fall under the same property tax umbrella that we won't cover in the presentation. If you have any questions on what's in that handout, please feel free to reach out.
Yes, and members, House Research basically said that if members have questions during the presentation, try and flag me down here and we'll get the questions answered as we go. Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and members, just a quick outline of what this presentation is going to cover. First, we'll start with a look at the property tax system, how it's structured, how property taxes are levied and distributed to the taxpayers. And then we'll take some time to look at different property tax relief mechanisms and state aid programs to local governments. And we'll talk about the state and local fiscal relationship within Minnesota, and then conclude with a look at tax increment financing. Just before we dive into the details of property taxes, I want to just put this tax in the context of all of the state and local revenues. Most of these we talked about in yesterday's presentation. But if you look at fiscal year 2024, total state and local tax collections were about $46.5 billion. Property taxes accounted for about 26% of that amount, or just over $12 billion. Most of that is revenue to local units of governments, although there is a state general property tax levy that is around $750 million that we'll talk about in a few slides. The property tax is primarily a local tax, so it's levied by local units of government that have property tax levy authority. These include counties, cities, townships, school districts, and special taxing districts. Special taxing districts are things like watershed districts, housing and redevelopment authorities. The Met Council is another example. There's a lot of ways that states structure their property tax systems. Minnesota has what's known as a levy-based system. And under this structure, what happens is that jurisdictions determine how much revenue they need to collect each year in property taxes, and they set a property tax levy equal to that amount. That levy then gets applied to all properties within the jurisdiction based on each property's share of the overall property tax base. And taxpayers don't need to write out individual payments to each of the jurisdictions separately. What they do is write one payment twice a year to the county. The county then collects the tax and distributes those funds to each of the local jurisdictions. The legislature over time has created a number of ways in which property tax relief can be provided to taxpayers. We'll talk about these in more detail later in the presentation, but I generally like to think of these as going into three different buckets. One of those is shifting of burdens, so you can provide property tax relief to certain types of properties or certain types of taxpayers by shifting the burden that that taxpayer would have paid onto other nearby properties. Examples of this would be things like the homestead market value exclusion, the market value exclusion for veterans with a disability, and some of the classification rates that we'll talk about as well. Another bucket that I would put property tax relief mechanisms into is the state paid relief bucket, and this includes things like property tax credits or property tax refunds. This is where the state makes payment directly on behalf of the taxpayer or directly to the taxpayer. And finally, there are ways in which the legislature has provided property tax relief by reducing or holding down local levies. This can be done through state aids to local governments and through levy limits. I should note that while levy limits have been used in the past, there currently aren't any levy limits in place, with the exception of some of the school district levies that aren't really under the purview of this committee. But the last time levy limits were in place was back in 2014. The property tax cycle in Minnesota actually occurs over 2 years. So for property taxes payable in 2025, the cycle actually began last year on January 2nd of 2024, when the counties determined valuations for each taxable property within the county. Notices of those valuations were mailed out in March, and then there was a period of time where taxpayers could appeal those valuations. In September, the local jurisdictions set their preliminary levies, or something that we'll also refer to them as truth in taxation levies. This is an amount that they think that they need to collect in the following calendar year. Notices of those levies and the impact that those levies would have on taxes get mailed out in November. And taxpayers have the opportunity to go to public hearings and give feedback to the local jurisdictions on that proposed levy. Those meetings typically happen in November and December. And then the jurisdictions finalize their 2025 levies at the end of December. Currently, the counties are calculating tax rates and calculating tax due on individual properties. Those final numbers will get mailed out in March, and taxpayers will make half of their property tax payment in May. And then depending on the property type, they'll pay the second half either in October or November. Most properties pay their second half payment in October. Agricultural properties have a little bit longer to make that second half payment, and will pay in November. Slide 7 shows how the tax is determined for an individual property. So first, each jurisdiction will set their property tax levy, and this is just how much the jurisdiction wants to collect in property taxes in a calendar year. And that levy gets divided by the property tax base. And for now, you can just think of that as the value of taxable property within the jurisdiction. That determines the jurisdiction's tax rate. And then that rate gets multiplied by the value of an individual property to determine how much that property needs to pay in property taxes. When we talk about value and property tax base, it's not just as simple as the market value of the property. This is where a lot of the complexity within the property tax system occurs. It's within the definition of this tax base. It's the legislature that determines how the tax base is calculated, and we'll get into the class rates in a couple of slides here, but Minnesota actually has two different tax bases, so that on step 1 of the current slide, that base in the bottom of the division on the left-hand side of the slide, there's actually two different types of bases that can be used to calculate property taxes. So one of those bases is known as referendum market value, and this only gets used for a small subset of property taxes, and those are school operating referendum levies, so this accounts for about 13% of all property taxes. This property tax base excludes agricultural property, seasonal recreational property, so things like cabins and resorts, as well as student housing. For most properties that are subject to these levies, their referendum market value, or the tax base used in this calculation, is just the estimated market value, or the value that the assessor puts on the property on January 2nd. The other tax base, which is the primary tax base and sort of the one we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation, is the net tax capacity tax base. I'll refer to this as NTC. It's a common acronym used in property taxes. And this is used for all other property tax levies. So all of your county levies, the remaining school district levies, cities, township levies, special taxing district levies all rely on net tax capacity. Net tax capacity for an individual property is calculated as the estimated market value minus any exclusions. So you would exclude the homestead market value exclusion or the disabled veterans exclusion. And then that amount gets multiplied by a classification rate. Sort of a simplified way to think about the effects of these classification rates is that a lower classification rate will result in lower tax on a property in proportion to its overall value, and a higher classification rate will result in higher taxes on a property in proportion to its overall value. So the next 3 slides really show you the impacts of classification rates and the net tax capacity tax base. So the slides 9 and 10 show some, not all of the classifications that are used in Minnesota's property tax system. Minnesota has a lot of classifications, depending on how you count them. It's somewhere between 50 and 60 unique individual property tax classifications. This is far more than most states have. If you compare to like Iowa, for example, I believe has 4. So we're generally higher than most other states in the number of classifications. Note that some property classifications have tiers. So the residential homesteads are a great example of this. Property that's valued under $500,000 just has one rate at 1%, but properties valued over that amount would have a class rate of 1% on the value up to $500,000 and a rate of 1.25% on any value over $500,000. Slide 10 is just a few more examples of classifications. Again, not going over all of them here, but when you get to slide 11, you'll see that sort of the effect of all of these classification rates. So slide 11 shows a sample calculation of property taxes on a few different types of property, each of them valued at $250,000. I'll note that exclusions and credits are accounted for here, but we're just going to focus on sort of the effects of the class rates. So if you had a property tax system that had no classification, all property types were treated the same. Each property that's valued the same within the same jurisdiction is going to pay the same amount of tax. But if you look at the third column on this table, you can see that property types with higher class rates end up having a higher net tax capacity, and they end up paying more taxes. And property types with lower class rates have a lower net tax capacity and end up paying less taxes. That's because the classification system will shift tax away from properties with low class rates onto property types with higher class rates. Another way to look at the impacts of classification is on slide 12. So in a property tax system that had no classification and treated all property types the same, these 2 different colored bars would be equal for each property type. So each property would pay tax equal to its proportion of the overall tax base. But you can see here the effects of classification shift tax away from properties like residential homesteads and agricultural properties and onto property types like commercial industrial property, public utility property, and apartments. So where do all these taxes go? Slide 13, you can see that for the most part, a lot of it goes to counties, cities, to a lesser extent townships, and to school districts. So each are collect around 30% of all property taxes paid. The city and town bar on this slide also includes property taxes that go into TIF districts, and Mr. Cope is going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. But you can see that the state general levy accounts for about 6% of total property taxes paid, and then special taxing districts collect around 4% of the tax. So as I mentioned already, there is a state general property tax. The levy amount is set in statute and is determined by the legislature. In 2024, the tax was about $759 million. We often talk about the state general levy as being one levy, but it is actually 2 separate levies, 2 separate dollar amounts applied to 2 separate groups of property. So the primary levy is on commercial industrial property, and that is about $717 million each year. And then there's a separate lower amount, about $42 million, that gets levied on seasonal recreational property. These are things like cabins and resorts. This levy was created in 2001 as a part of a larger property tax reform effort in that year. And as a part of that effort, the state took over the state general education levy, which increased state aid to local school districts. At this time, that referendum market value tax base was also created so that ag properties and seasonal recreational properties were exempt from some of those school referendum levies. And then there was also a class rate compression at this time that lowered the classification rates on commercial and industrial property. The effect of that shifted taxes away from commercial and industrial property and onto other property types. So this levy was created in its original form in 2001, sort of in the context of that larger reform effort, but it has changed a bit since then. So some of the changes in recent years include the elimination of the inflationary increase. So when this levy was first created, it was indexed to inflation and increased every year. That was eliminated in 2017. There have been a couple of rounds of reductions in the overall levy in 2019 and 2021. And also now the first $150,000 of value of commercial property is not subject to the levy. Comparing Minnesota to other states, so this is something that comes from a report that's put out each year by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in conjunction with the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence. They produce the 50-state property tax comparison report where they compare property taxes in states, property tax burdens between all 50 states. So the way they do this is that they look at both the largest city in every state and then a single rural city in every state, and they compare the property tax burdens for different types of properties between those jurisdictions. So for Minnesota, Minneapolis is used for the large city rankings, and the city of Glencoe is used for the rural city rankings. I won't walk through each one of these here, but you can see, for the median value home and the apartment properties, Minnesota is generally middle of the pack, maybe slightly higher than the 50th percentile. And then for commercial and industrial property, the state tends to be higher. And this is, again, the effect of those classification rates and the classification system, as well as the effect of the state general levy. Shifting now over to looking at property tax relief programs, we're going to highlight some of the ways that the legislature has sort of created mechanisms to provide relief to property taxpayers. These go into really three different buckets: state aid to local governments, state aid property tax credits, and state aid property tax refunds. I will start by looking at some of the major state aids to local governments. So the largest general purpose state aid to local governments is the City Local Government Aid Program. We often just refer to this as LGA. LGA pays about $644 million annually through a need-based formula. All 855 cities are eligible for aid. I should note that that 855 number is for aid payable in 2025. Minnesota got a new city in 2025, so in the fall of 2025, what had been the township of Baldwin incorporated into a city, so that number will increase to 856 in 2026. But in 2025, all cities are eligible for aid, but under the distribution formula, there's 106 cities that receive $0 in aid, which means that about 750 cities will actually receive LGA in 2025. Now, this is a general purpose aid. It's really meant to supplement property taxes, and this just means that there aren't really any requirements for what cities can spend the money on. I think the best way to think about this is if a city can spend their property tax revenues on it, they could use LGA for that same purpose. LGA has existed in some form for around 50 years. It's gone through a lot of changes. The most recent changes in 2017, 2019, and 2023 increased the overall appropriation. The most recent increase was in 2023, which increased the overall appropriation by $80 million. Since LGA became a city-only aid program a couple of decades ago, generally around every 10 years, the legislature looks at the distribution formula and tries to update it. The last time that happened was in 2023. That change to the formula did not change the overall structure of the distribution formula. What it did do is take a look at the factors that determine need within the formula, and we'll look at those in 2 slides. But it looked at the factors that are used to determine need under the formula and updated some of those.
Representative Joy.
Thank you, Chair David. Say, one of the questions, I'm sure a lot of people or people that aren't familiar, there's 106 will not receive LGA. And can you explain what makes that criteria, just so for definite? Thank you.
Mr. Swanson.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Representative Joy, there can be a few different reasons for that. On slide 20, we'll talk a little bit about how the formula functions, but, so I'll touch on this again when we get there, but for most cities that are receiving 0 LGA, it's mainly because of the strength of their property tax base. So the formula accounts for property tax base, and it looks at that, property value per capita. And generally, cities that have the highest property tax base are the ones that are receiving no LGA. There are some exceptions to that. There could be cities that have lower tax bases that just under the need factors aren't as needy, but typically that's the reason for that.
Vice Chair Joy.
Thank you. That's it.
Representative Whitty.
Thank you, Chair Davids. Is there any specifics on how they utilize this money?
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and Representative Whitty, generally no. So this is meant to supplement property taxes. So anything a city can use their property taxes for, they could spend LGA on those same purposes.
Representative Whitty. Thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Swanson.
Slide 19 just shows the historic overall appropriations for LGA going back to 2011. You can see some of those recent appropriation increases that I referenced a few minutes ago, the largest of which again happened in 2023 with an $80 million increase. The appropriation is set in statute, and it's ongoing and stays at the same level unless that is changed by the legislature. So getting into the formula a little bit, I mentioned that this is a need-based formula, and what the formula attempts to do is distribute more aid to cities that the formula determines need more money. And the way it determines which cities need more money is by looking at 2 different factors. So it looks at how needy the city is, how much money does the city need, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, how that gets determined. And then it also looks at each city's ability to pay. And ability to pay is determined by looking at the tax base within the city and applying the statewide average property tax rate to the city's tax base. So you can think of this as the formula basically saying, you have some need within your city, and we're going to determine what that is. But we also know that you have the ability to cover some of this need through your property tax base. And if we apply the average city tax rate, or the average of what all cities are charging for their property, the tax rate that they're all charging for their property taxes, the formula expects cities to sort of account for a certain amount of revenue on their own from their property taxes. So how need gets determined within the formula varies by city size. So cities with a population under 2,500, need is solely based on population. So if cities with higher population are assumed to have higher need, cities with lower population are assumed to have lower need. For cities with a population between 2,500 and 10,000, need is determined by 3 different factors. So the percentage of the housing stock in the city built before 1940, the peak population decline within the city since 1970, and the share of the tax base that's classified as commercial, industrial, or public utility property. And finally, for larger cities with a population of 10,000 or more, they have the same 3 factors as the medium-sized cities, plus 1 additional factor, and that's the share of the population within the city that's age 65 or older. So each of these cities are divided into one of these 3 groups, and the formula determines need based on these factors, subtracts off the city's ability to pay, which is the statewide tax rate times the city's tax base, and that determines how much LGA a city will get. And to Representative Joy's question, just going back 1 slide, for cities that are receiving 0 LGA, it's really that ability to pay portion of this formula that's mainly driving it. There is a township LGA program, we often just refer to this simply as town aid. So all 1,776 townships receive township aid. There was a time where the city LGA program also made payments to townships. That was eliminated in the 90s. For a time, townships didn't receive any LGA payments. A new separate town aid was created in 2013. And the formula uses the portion of the township that's classified as agricultural property, the size of the town, and the population of the town in order to determine how much aid it gets. I mentioned that all towns do receive some aid, but there are 3 counties which don't have any townships. Hennepin County is one that's completely organized into only cities. And then Coochin County and Lake of the Woods County are only organized into cities and unorganized areas, so there are no townships within those 2 counties that receive any of this aid. The aid distributes $10 million annually, and like LGA, this is just a number that's set in statute. The last state aid program we're going to look at is county program aid. We'll often just refer to this as CPA. CPA is a lot like LGA, but for counties. It distributes $342 million annually, and aid is distributed to all 87 counties. There are actually 2 separate formulas that distribute two different pots of money. One is a need-based formula, and the other formula is based off of each county's tax base. We'll talk about more of those and talk about those more in 2 slides. Again, just like LGA, county program aid is a general purpose aid. So it's really meant to supplement supplement property taxes. And again, similar to Representative Woody's question about LGA, CPA can be used for pretty much anything that the counties would use their property tax revenues for. There have been a number of increases in the county program aid appropriation in the last 15 years. Like LGA, CPA was increased by $80 million in 2023. You'll notice in 2025, there's a $3 million drop in the county program aid appropriation. This is the result of a 2014 law that provided for 10 years an additional $3 million in aid to Beltrami County. That provision expired after 2024, so that automatically lowers the final total overall CPA amount to $342 million. I mentioned that there are actually 2 different formulas for county program aid that distribute 2 separate pots of money. So one of those formulas is a need-based formula that tries to give more money to counties with higher need. And need is determined on the share of population within the county age 65 or older. The number of Part 1 crimes, which are also known as Group A offenses, which these are serious crimes within the county, and then the number of households receiving federal SNAP benefits. And then the other formula distributes aid based on county tax base makeup. So counties that have sort of lower tax bases get higher aid amounts.
Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I just want to go back to the slide before where you showed the $8 million increase in 2023. Was that tied to any COVID aid or anything? Why such a dramatic increase that year?
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and Representative Robbins, it wasn't tied to, I guess maybe it wasn't explicitly or directly tied to the expiration of any COVID funding. There was just an effort that year to increase the appropriations for both LGA and CPA. And the final tax bill that was enacted both got $80 million increases.
Representative Robbins.
Thank you. So really part of the $18 billion surplus was used for this.
Mr. Swanson, careful.
Mr. Chair and Representative Robbins, maybe what I'll say to that is that so that increase, that $80 million increase for both LGA and CPA were first went into effect in 2024, and that those increases are ongoing. So to the extent that any sort of one-time money or surplus money was spent in 2023, these increases are sort of permanent and set in statute going forward.
And that was a good question, Representative Robbins. It really was.
And one more.
Yeah, sure.
And so do you know, looking at the current budget forecast, how much of the deficit we're projecting could be tied to that money, that's ongoing increase?
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and Representative Robbins, that would be a great question for Ms. Highmark and/or maybe Ms. Templin when they come up in a few minutes.
Fantastic,
Representative
thank you.
Robbins.
Thank you.
Now, that's very interesting. You know, how, when the $18 billion disappeared, how do we maintain that? In what areas do we see it? And that's, I think, a very good question. Mr. Swanson. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Witt.
Thank you, Chair David. So I see that there's very specific needs for the aid. I guess my question is, you know, Part 1 crimes. The number one function of the cities is to protect them. It looks like if they're not spending their money on that and using it for other things, what's the need for the aid? And so I don't know if there's any checks and balances on this, but obviously, you know, for population age 65 and older, there's programs there. The federal nutrition assistance, there's programs there. Part 1, Part 2 crimes, it's how we fund our police departments. So there's no checks and balances, I guess is my answer, question.
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and Representative Woody, there are no requirements in statute that say what county program aid needs to be spent on. There are no reporting requirements to the Department of Revenue or to the legislature or anything like that. So it's really just a general purpose aid. The money gets paid out to counties and I'm sure it kind of goes into the general fund and gets spent the same way their property tax revenues get spent.
Representative Witte.
Is there a way, obviously, we can create bills and stuff like that to make sure that the needs are being, number one, public safety, and then all the other ones. So there is a way to do it through a bill, I'm assuming?
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and Representative Woody, yes, the legislature would need to, enact a law in order to either require the funds be spent on specific purposes or to ask for any reporting from counties on what they spend the money on.
Thank you.
Representative Witte.
Yep, thank you.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you. As a former county commissioner and have seen the county program aid and stuff, and it's kind of an interesting discussion, I think, just because the state taketh and the giveth and the taketh away. I mean, especially with the county program aid, you can say the county program aid is used to offset the mandates that are sent down to the counties that are taking money away, and the governor's budget is an example of what he wants to taketh away by adding, making his office look better by pushing the money down to the county. So the county then relies on this county program aid to offset what the state is basically mandating them to spend on it. So I would not necessarily be in favor then to turn around and say, you have to use this money for specific reasons, because then all of a sudden you have the state again mandating what the counties can do. And so I think it defeats some of the help that is going down to the counties to provide some relief from the constant desire to take the money from the counties.
So Representative Johnson, you're referring to the governor's proposed budget that we can't hear because the department won't work with us to get us numbers. That one you're talking about?
I am.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Do you have any other questions?
No, thank you, Chair.
Representative Johnson. And I think Representative Johnson brings up a great point, and maybe I could, down the road, call on the county, the EMC, because you make a very, very good point. So we give them 80 million more, but what I want to know is how much more do they have to spend because of mandates we put on them? So maybe, Mr. Hilgard, you could follow up with me later. That's a real problem. We dump a lot of stuff on the counties, and we're not funding it. So we'll get some numbers for everybody on there when I can talk to the department again. Representative Joy?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Davids. One of the things, when we talk about LGA, being a small town mayor, we got LGA, 51% of our budget was spent on public safety. And so a lot of our money was invested into that. When you talk to the county, I know one of my counties is gonna spend $86,000 changing the seal in the flag. So when we talk about the increases of county aid or LGA, a lot of that is the mandates that we sent from the state of Minnesota, so thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Otherwise, yeah, Representative Harder?
Thank you, Chair Davids. I would agree on the county program aid about the number of mandates that counties are required to fulfill. And it is sometimes, in my opinion, I feel it's excessive. I mean, I used to work at the county government as well. And sometimes I don't view county program aid as property tax relief because I don't see it on my tax notice, right? So I get my tax notice and I see what the estimated market value is, and I see any kind of, you know, homestead credit or whatever exclusions that maybe I apply for, but I don't see anything on there that would relate to county program aid. And so many people in the county don't understand or even know about county program aid. And so when you talk about it, you know, they may not know. And I'm just letting you know that sometimes I don't feel that it is tax relief, just so you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Harder. Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair, maybe briefly before I continue on, just to Representative Harder's point about state aids to local governments sort of being considered property tax relief. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the state and local fiscal relations and talk about sort of why historically the legislature has considered state aids to local governments in the same, at least within the same committee and generally in sort of the same areas as property tax relief. But there's a little bit of history behind that. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Mr. Swanson.
So moving on, now instead of looking at state aids to local governments, I'm going to talk about a couple of property tax credits. So property tax credits function as a relief mechanism by directly reducing an individual property taxpayer's final property tax bill. So for a property taxpayer that's receiving a credit, the county will calculate their total property taxes due, apply the credit to that final amount, subtract the credit from the final amount, and the taxpayer will actually pay less. The state will then make payments on behalf of the people receiving those credits to the local jurisdiction. So they'll pay, the portion of the county, city, school district, and special taxing district taxes that the taxpayer did not pay because they received the credit. So the first credit I'm going to talk about is the school building bond agricultural credit. If you serve on any of the education committees, you might hear this referred to as the Ag to School credit. This was created in 2017 and has grown to become the largest property tax credit by dollar amount. So the credit paid out about $109 million in 2024. The credit goes to agricultural properties, agricultural land. So the portion of an agricultural property that's made up of the house, we call it the house, garage, and 1 acre. So it's basically the portion of an ag property that is really the home of the individual who lives there is excluded from the credit, but any other remaining portion of the yard or any of the agricultural land is eligible for the credit. The credit covers a portion of the property taxes due on the property that can be attributed to school building bond referendum levies. So say a school district holds a referendum to maybe build or renovate a new school. Then they will levy property taxes to pay off the bonds that they use to fund that project. Those levies that go to pay off those bonds are the levies that are eligible for this particular credit. When the credit was first created, it covered 40% of the cost of those bonds to the individual taxpayer. That amount has been increased over the years and is now at 70%. The next property tax credit I'm going to touch on is the agricultural homestead market value credit. This is the second largest credit in terms of dollar amount. This credit paid out $37.4 million in 2024. It is another credit that is available for agricultural properties, but unlike the school building bond agricultural credit, this is only available to homesteaded agricultural property. So the property has to be homesteaded in order to receive it. It is just a flat percentage of the property's value that determines the credit. It very quickly reaches the maximum amount of $490. So any property that's valued $115,000 or more is going to receive the maximum credit of $490. This credit has been in place since 2001 and it has been sort of in its current form for quite a while. Mr. Chair, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Williams to talk a little bit about property tax refunds.
Mr. Williams.
Chair Davidson, members, for the record, I'm Sean Williams from House Research. So I'm going to give Mr. Swanson a break and talk about the two property tax refund programs. These are a little bit different than the credits that Mr. Swanson discussed earlier, in that they don't appear on your property tax statement and aren't sort of administered by the county. They're instead administered by the state. They're refunds paid directly to either renters or homeowners. They're designed to provide property tax relief to homeowners and renters whose property taxes are high relative to their incomes. So there's a formula in law that says if an individual's property tax exceeds a certain percentage of their income, they get a refund back that's sort of a percentage of an amount, part of the amount above that percentage. You may know that the renter's credit was previously administered as a standalone credit, so you'd apply for that on a separate form. The 2023 tax bill converted that to an income tax credit. So starting this year, so returns filed this year for last tax year, the renter's credit will begin to be administered as an income tax credit and be part of the income tax system. This has some data on the size of these two programs. I typically only present 1 year's worth of data, but the most recent year for returns filed in 2023 included a one-time increase that was enacted in 2023. So the combined amount of these two programs was $774.6 million in returns filed in 2022. There was that one-time bump in law that increased it to about 1.1 billion for returns filed in 2023. But I'd say that the 2022 returns are sort of a better measure of what the program will look like going forward. For 2024 refunds filed this year, homeowners are eligible if their household income is below $139,320. The maximum refund amount is $3,410. That maximum amount does scale down as income increases. For renters, the formula sort of assumes that 17% of the rent that you actually paid represents property taxes, so that's how the formula is calculated. That percentage has been increased and decreased in the past in law. The maximum household income eligible for the renter's credit is $77,570. The maximum refund is $2,720. Finally, there's something called the special or additional property tax refund. It's sometimes called targeting. This program is different than the other two property tax refund programs because it's not based on income. It's specifically designed to provide relief to homeowners who have a property tax increase of more than 12% year over year. So household income is not considered. The maximum refund is $1,000. Similar to the other property tax refund programs, there was a one-time increase that was enacted in law for returns filed in 2023. So, under $10 million is a typical cost for this program historically. It sometimes gets above that if there's very large year-over-year property tax increases in the state. So, given that there's been high levy increases lately, there may be a higher cost in more recent years. But that 2023 one-time change increased the amount of refunds to about $43 million.
Mr. Swanson. Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and members, there are a number of other state aid and state aids and credits that are under the purview of this committee that we're not going to go into more detail on. Ms. Highmark will have a little bit of information just on the relative size of each of these. There's also more information in that larger handout that I referenced at the beginning of the presentation. If members have questions on any of these, please feel free to reach out. So the final property tax relief mechanism that I'm going to talk about is the Senior Citizens Property Tax Deferral Program. So unlike the other mechanisms that I've covered where a person's, where the mechanism reduces the overall tax paid by an individual permanently, either through a credit or a refund, the deferral program allows participants within the program to defer a portion of their property taxes and pay them at a later date. So the program is open to senior citizens. They have to be age 65 or older with a household income of $96,000 or less and have lived in their home for at least 5 years. People who are participating will then pay 3% of their household income toward their property taxes. Any amount over that amount gets covered by the state. The state makes payments to the local governments on behalf of the individual and then encumbers the property with a lien. The homeowner is then required to pay back any deferred property taxes with interest when they leave the program. So that could happen in a variety of ways. It could be through the death of any qualifying homeowners living in the property. If the property owner sells the property, they need to repay the deferred taxes. If the owner just decides to no longer participate in the program, they have to repay the taxes. And then if the property is no longer the homestead of the property owner, that would also trigger the requirement that they repay the deferred taxes. In 2023, there were about 400 participants in this program, and they had about $1.7 million in property taxes deferred.
You know, Mr. Swanson, 65 isn't really that old. Okay. Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair and members, I'm going to wrap up by talking just over 3 slides, a little bit about the state and local fiscal relationship. So one of the themes that we wanted to kind of get across in the presentations, both yesterday and today, was sort of a broad framework for thinking about how tax collections function within this relationship between the state government and local units of government. So we sort of covered the broadly yesterday state tax revenues and the local revenues, either through property taxes or state-based aid today. But the next few slides will sort of look how all of these work together within the state and fiscal local relationship. So you may remember a slide from yesterday that Mr. Williams showed that had Minnesota rankings for different tax types. If you still have your slides from yesterday, it was slide 45. It looked like this. So the top three bars on that slide show first state taxes as a share of personal income, then state and local taxes as a share of personal income, and then the third one is state and local taxes and fees as a share of personal income. And what you see on those 3 lines of that slide is that Minnesota's rankings compared to other states falls first when you add in local taxes, and then falls again when you add in local taxes and fees. And one of the things that this suggests, not the only thing, but one of the things that this suggests is that Minnesota tends to rely more heavily on centralized tax collection at the state level, and then uses some of those funds to partially offset taxes at the local level. And this is a major feature within Minnesota's state and local fiscal relationship that has really been in place since 1971. So if you go back prior to 1971, the first slide that I showed today had that pie chart that showed property taxes as a share of total state and local collections, and it was about 26%. If you were to create that same slide, that same pie chart for, say, something in the mid-1960s, by far the biggest piece of that pie would have been property taxes. So prior to 1971, nearly all revenue for local governments came from property taxes. At this time, there were large disparities in funding between local governments, and this was especially true among school districts. Typically, what you saw during this time were the districts that had the highest per pupil spending were also the districts that had the lowest property tax rates. And all of this really changed in 1971 with the Minnesota Miracle, and there was a large, really fiscal reform effort that had a lot of aspects, and I'm only going to touch on a couple of them here. But one of the things that that reform effort did was that the school took over not only a larger share of school funding, but also increased aids to local governments. So this sort of gets back to Representative Harder's comment earlier about, sort of why do we think about state aids as property tax relief? Well, part of this reform effort was to increase state aid to school districts, to counties, cities, and townships. Prior to 1971, property taxes were really high in the state, and part of this effort was an attempt to reduce property taxes through a couple of mechanisms. One of those was state aids. The other one was at this time, the state also created certain property tax credits for homeowners to try to lower property tax burdens. On the school funding side, prior to 1971, the school covered about a little over 40% of the costs for operating schools in the state. Post 1971, that went up to around 65%. I believe it's higher than that now. All of this all this increased aid, increased property tax relief, increased funding for schools was all paid for by mainly by 2 things: increases to the state income tax, So the reforms in 1971 resulted in about a 22% increase in income taxes, and then also an increase to the newly enacted statewide sales tax. So the statewide sales tax came in at, I think, 1967 at 3%. This reform effort in 1971 increased that rate even more to cover the state costs for increased aid to local governments and increased property tax relief. That system that reform effort created it really was the basis for the system that we have today. We still have a system where revenues for local governments don't only come from property taxes, but state aids to those local governments make up a large portion of their revenue share as well. And we also have a system that prioritizes interregional equity. And you can see this, I think, in three ways. One is sort of when I've talked about formulas for some of the state aid programs today, I've mentioned that they generally try to give more money to jurisdictions that need more money. So there's an effort to determine need within a lot of these formulas and give higher amounts of aid to jurisdictions that need more aid. You can also see it in the prohibition of local sales and local income taxes that we talked about yesterday. Part of the rationale for both of those prohibitions was to reduce revenue inequalities between local jurisdictions. And you can also see this in a program that did not make the slides this year, but it is a major property tax program, and that's the Fiscal Disparities Program that exists in the metro area and up on the Iron Range as well. And those programs result in property tax-based sharing between jurisdictions within each of those areas. Lastly, sort of one final way to look at this relationship is looking at those historical state and local tax collections. Going back to 1957 on this slide, so you can see prior to 1971 that property taxes were by far the largest tax paid by Minnesotans. You can see the vertical line on the graph represents the Minnesota Miracle, and you can see that the property tax relief was funded primarily through the increases to the income tax and the increase to the statewide sales tax. And
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Any additional questions for Mr. Swanson? Representative Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important that we point out, and this isn't a policy opinion, but because they're so reliant on the income tax, that also is what creates these big changes in, surplus one year, deficit there. I mean, it fluctuates much more than the property tax did throughout history. Is that correct? Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Anderson. Mr. Swanson?
Mr. Chair, that concludes my portion of the presentation, and Mr. Cope is going to go through tax increment financing.
Thank you. And for everyone that's testifying here, members, these are brilliant people that you will want to be able to talk to. They've got a lot of information. If they don't know it off the top of their head, they will get it for you. Please identify yourself for the record, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Justin Cope. I'm a legislative analyst for the House Research Department. Since I missed introductions yesterday, I'll just say briefly that for House Research, I cover mortgage and deed taxes, special assessments, tax forfeiture, legal issues in local taxation, solid and hazardous waste taxes, and tax increment financing, which I'm going to speak about next.
Thank you. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. So tax increment financing, or TIF, is a tool that state law allows local governments to use to finance real estate development within their borders. TIF captures increases in property taxes caused by a development and uses it to pay off debts incurred in the development process. And there are different types of TIF districts designed with different purposes. For example, housing districts are designed to develop housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households, and redevelopment districts are designed to remediate blight. I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about the mechanics of tax increment financing. After a local government adopts a TIF plan and then requests that the county auditor certify the TIF district, the auditor goes in and certifies the district's net tax capacity and the original local tax rate, which is the sum of all local tax rates. And then in each year after certification, the auditor will subtract the original net tax capacity from the current net tax capacity in the district to determine the captured net tax capacity. The amount of increment that then is delivered to the local government unit using TIF is equal to the multiple of the captured net tax capacity and the lesser of the local taxing district's tax rates or the original local tax rate. So for illustrative purposes, I'm just gonna show a slide that displays how this might impact property tax collections. So for the purposes of this slide, we're assuming that the property before development has a net tax capacity of 75%, that each local taxing district, with the exception of special districts, are accounting for 30% of the local tax rate, and that the special districts are accounting for 10% of the local tax rate, and that the cumulative local tax rate is 100%. So in year zero, the net tax capacity is assumed to be 75,000, and each tax district is collecting equal shares. Without TIF being used, as the net tax capacity doubles, each local government's unit's tax collections from the tax increment, from the development doubles, and as the property values quintuple in year 20, each taxing district has had its revenues quintuple. If you look now to the second table, this will display how property tax revenues would be distributed instead if TIF were used to create that development. So in year one, each local taxing district's revenues are equal. And then in year 5, after development is incurred and the net tax capacity has doubled, you'll see that the city is now collecting 50% of the property tax revenues, 50% of the property tax revenues as tax increment financing, and that the school, county, and special tax districts each have the same property tax revenues from that property that they had when the net tax capacity was at 75,000. And then in year 20, the net tax capacity of the property has quintupled, and 80% of that amount is being collected as increment and given to the city, while the taxing districts are still collecting the same amount in property tax revenues as they did in year zero. So that said, there are some restrictions on the use of tax increment financing. First, there's limitations on when these districts can be established. Local governments must adopt findings that a proposed district passes the but-for test, which essentially requires that they find that the development would not have occurred except for the use of tax increment financing. And in all but housing districts, there is an additional requirement that the local government using TIF find that the value of their property after using TIF to develop it will be greater than the amount that the property might have been expected to reach in value had TIF not been used. For most types of TIF district, the local government must also adopt a finding that there's some statutory criteria warranting creation of the TIF district. For example, there are blight finding requirements for redevelopment districts. There are also numerous restrictions on the use of increment. So the revenue that's collected and delivered to the local government unit as increment is not something delivered to the general fund for use on whatever the city might want to use it for, or whatever local government using TIF might want to use it for. Those revenues are earmarked for uses consistent with the TIF Act. So generally, increment has to be used primarily on the sort of project that the type of district is designed for. So for example, housing districts have to use their increment on housing. TIF restrictions also prevent increment use on general government purposes. And for most TIF types, most increment must be spent within the TIF district. And Mr. Chair, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much. Your questions for Mr. Pope. And I would just say on TIF, over the years, cities can be very creative, and they can want to use TIF funds for various things that clearly are out of bounds, and we just kind of bring them back in the fold, and I'm a big supporter of TIF, I think I've supported every TIF bill around, except the one when the city will remain unnamed. They wanted to have a TIF district to bail out a bankrupt TIF district. That was even a little much for me. That one we didn't do. So, as cities are bringing in TIF projects, you'll have an, open forum here. But let's really work on staying within the parameters of the program. So with that, I think we're going to, and Cindy, House Fiscal, I want to give you the time you need, so I think we're going to go into tomorrow. You'll be first on the docket, even before the bills. We want to hear from you, but we want to give you ample time. Any other questions for the good of the order? With that, members, good government all the time. We are adjourned.